When the word Holocaust is said, what comes to mind? No, we're not talking about Hitler or the Jews. Across the continent, on the other side of the world, was another Holocaust.
During the Second World War, over 6 million Chinese were tortured, massacred, experimented on, and raped in an event as horrible, if not more horrible, than the acts of the Nazis, and today, nobody is taking a stand for the victims.
Japan has consistently displayed a lack of remorse for its government's actions during World War II. Germany has confessed committing its crimes under Hitler and expressed an official apology. Japan has not. Germany has compensated many of its victims. Japan has not. Germany has punished its war criminals. Japan has not. Most importantly, Germany has mandated that all children within its borders learn in detail the terrible history of the Nazi regime. Japan, on the other hand, has unfalteringly kept the story of its war crimes out of its history books.
The notorious Unit 731, a secret military medical unit that researched biological and chemical weapons, committed the majority of these crimes.
I cut him open from the chest to the stomach, and he screamed terribly, and his face was all twisted in agony. When asked why this was being done to him, it was explained that he was a Chinese prisoner deliberately infected with the plague as part of a research project.
Plague bombs were developed and used on the Chinese, who were then torn apart, organ by organ, to see what the effects of the plague were. No anesthetic was used, out of concern that it might affect the results.
A Chinese woman regained consciousness while being vivisected alive. She opened her eyes, and then she hollered, "It's all right to kill me, but please spare my child's life."
The first time, I was very hesitant to do what I was told to do. The second time, you get used to it. The third time, you more or less volunteered.
Many horrific experiments were performed on prisoners of war, such as locking diseased prisoners with healthy ones to see how quickly various diseases would spread, or to determine how much pressure the body can withstand. People were put inside pressure chambers, suffering terrible agony before their eyes exploded from their sockets and blood forced out from their skin. Some were denied food or water to determine maximum survival length. Others were mummified alive in total dehydration experiments.
Frostbite experiments were performed where prisoners were tied down in freezing weather and left with exposed arms. The arms were periodically drenched with water until frozen solid. The arms were then amputated. Doctors would repeat the process on the upper arm, then the shoulder, then the legs until just a head and torso remained. The prisoner was then used for plague experiments.
Victims were burned to death with flamethrowers, bombarded with lethal doses of X-rays, spun to death in centrifuges, injected with animal blood and air bubbles, surgical removal of the stomachs, then the esophagus was directly attached to the intestines, amputation of arms and reattached on the opposite sides, or gassed to death in chambers.
Doctors experimented on babies, including 3-day-olds. Their temperature would be measured with a needle stuck inside the infant's middle finger to keep it straight and to prevent the baby's hand from clenching into a fist.
Plague-infected fleas were dropped over villages, where casualties were recorded for medical purposes. Cholera and typhoid cultures were dropped into wells, reservoirs, and ponds. The Japanese distributed to villages cakes, food, drink, and children's candies that were infected.
Glander's disease, first found only in horses, was unleashed upon towns where 1 in 20 survived, and those who lived are dealing with open, rotting sores to this day. 65 years after the fact, Chinese are still suffering. Still, there are no efforts to help the victims.
Bombs were dropped on our village, but they didn't explode. Instead, rice and fleas poured out. My brother was infected with something. His glands swelled and his limbs filled with fluid. He was entirely deep purple. Eventually he died screaming, as did my 2-year-old sister.
Wu Shigen's family was infected with the bubonic plague.
Following many investigations thoroughly proving that germ warfare was waged, the Japanese government admitted using biological weapons for the first time in 2002, following 27 court hearings. The only atrocities worse than those committed by doctors and surgeons were things done by the Japanese soldiers for fun.
The soldiers followed their orders and more. The military doctrine was kill all, burn all, loot all. On December 14, 1937, Major General Sasaki Toichi gave the order to kill all captives.
I was evil. I was a devil. We all were.
Brutalities included excavating the heart, decapitation, drowning, punching the body and eyes with an awl, burned alive, used as bayonet targets, live burials, castration, carving organs, roasting of people, hanging people by their tongues on iron hooks, and burying people to their waists and letting them be torn apart by dogs.
It was ultimately about competition. How many you killed becomes a standard of achievement.
Soldiers impaled babies on bayonets and tossed them alive into pots of boiling water. They gang-raped women from the ages of 12 to 80 and then killed them when they could no longer satisfy sexual requirements. I beheaded people, starved them to death, and buried them alive. Over 200 in all. It is terrible that I could turn into an animal and do these things. There really are no words to explain what I was doing. I was truly a devil.
No matter how young or old, none of the women we rounded up could escape being raped. Each one was allocated to 15 or 20 soldiers for sexual intercourse and abuse. After the rapes, we always stabbed them and killed them, because dead bodies don't talk.
I was so immune to murder that I thought nothing of chopping up a rape victim, cooking her flesh, and serving it to my troops.
Some Japanese soldiers who were hungry had killed a 16-year-old Chinese boy and eaten some of his meat and sold the rest to a merchant. I can't forget the fact that I ate a human being. We should absolutely apologize to China, absolutely.
But China would receive no apology from the Japanese, or support from the United States, Great Britain, or any of the Allies.
Even before the guns of World War II fell silent, a new menace to the United States was rising, the Soviet Union. The U.S. needed Japan as an ally in Asia to fend off the communists in Russia and later China. So unlike Germany, where the system that had been created under Nazism had been completely dismantled, the recriminations against Japan were largely superficial.
A few high-level leaders, like former Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, were tried, convicted, and hanged, but their trials focused mainly on the sufferings of POWs, ignoring the occurrences in Japanese-occupied countries. Many war criminals were released by General Douglas MacArthur, American commander of the occupation. Emperor Hirohito was even granted immunity by the U.S. and never had to worry about a day in court.
And why did this happen? The American government felt that prolonging the prosecutions of Japanese war criminals would alienate the nation's citizens, thus depriving the U.S. of a valuable bulwark against communism.
Whenever the Japanese military conquered an area, it recruited girls and young women to be Taishintai, which means volunteer corps. This was condoned by the military. The rationale was first recorded in 1932 when Lieutenant General Okamura Yasuji requested a shipment of comfort women for his troops in Shanghai as a solution for the 223 reported rapes by his troops. Comfort stations were set up throughout occupied China and used extensively to calm troops until the war ended in 1945.
Kim Yoon-shim, a Chinese national, was abducted by the Japanese army when she was 13 years old.
It was common for young women to be forced into sexual service 20 to 50 times a day. Many committed suicide. Others tried to escape.
During a rainstorm, Kim tried to escape. She sought refuge in a house, only to discover that it was occupied by Japanese soldiers.
I was beaten up and tortured. My feet were broken and my spine cracked. They hung me upside down, poured water in my nostrils, and stuck pins in me.
She contracted gonorrhea and syphilis during the war. Many women became sterile because of their repeated rapes.
Many did become pregnant from the rapes. Those who were received an injection of terramycin, which the comfort women referred to as number 606. This would make the women's bodies swell up and induce an abortion. If that failed, soldiers would sit on the pregnant stomach until the unborn baby came out, where it was then killed. The women would then be raped without recovery period.
As of today, there is no compensation or apology for these victims. During the 51st session of the United Nations Commission on Human Rights in 1996, Karen Parker had the following statement.
Mr. Chairman, how much compensation do you think ought to be paid to a woman who was raped 7,500 times? What would the members of the Commission want for their daughters if their daughters had been raped even once? China, Korea, Philippines, Burma, these are your daughters. How can the international community, even though dominated by men, fail to demand that Japan provide meaningful compensation for each of these women? Our research shows that more than half of the girls and women died as a result of the treatment they received. Taking the lowest figure at any given time, there were about 20,000 military comfort women. Each of them was raped at least 5 times per day. That means that there was at least 100,000 rapes per day arranged by the Japanese authorities and carried out by its soldiers. Even assuming only 5 years of program, there were at least 125 million rapes.
The Japanese government has yet to fully acknowledge and make a public apology for their involvement in sexual slavery in regards to comfort women.
Nobody has taken a stand for the Chinese victims of World War II. The atrocities committed by the Japanese are now being removed from Japanese and American textbooks. It appears that unless someone takes a stand now, the world may forget the horrors of another Holocaust.